The station called Throne of Indulgence hung in the black void of space like a jewel made of cruelty and gold, spinning slowly above a dying red star that no one cared to name anymore. And Captain Ethan Cole stood at the airlock, watching the docking clamps seal his small courier ship to its hull with a sound like bones clicking together. He had been to ugly places before, places where the walls were stained with things he did not want to think about, but this station had a different kind of ugliness, the kind that dressed itself in silk and smiled at you while it chewed on something still screaming. "Captain," said Mara, his ship's artificial intelligence, her voice cool and steady in his earpiece. "I want to remind you that this banquet is essential to the Cassara Belt mineral negotiations, and that any cultural offense could cost Earth access to 17 billion tons of raw tritanium." "You've told me 4 times, Ethan said. "And yet your heart rate suggests you are not listening," Mara replied. He walked through the airlock and into the station, and the air hit him first, warm and thick and sweet like rotting flowers dipped in honey, and the corridors were wide enough for species 3 times his size, lined with living bioluminescent plants that pulsed in slow rhythms as if the whole station was breathing. Ethan was not a diplomat by nature. He was a soldier who had been asked to carry papers instead of a rifle because Earth needed people who could keep their mouths shut and their eyes open. And he had done that job well enough for 6 years, running freight and treaties between species that could have crushed humanity like an insect if they ever decided it was worth the effort. Humanity was new out here, barely 2 centuries into faster-than-light travel, and in the grand hierarchy of galactic civilizations, they ranked somewhere between mildly interesting and not worth conquering yet, which suited most humans just fine. The Glaciari were different matter entirely. They were old, older than most living species could remember, and they had built their power not on technology or war, but on appetite, on the idea that the universe existed to be consumed, and that the species strong enough to eat whatever it wanted had earned the right to do so. Archon Vreth Salon was the regional overlord of this sector, and he had invited Ethan personally to this banquet, which was either a great honor or a trap, and Ethan had not yet decided which. The banquet hall was enormous, a cathedral of dark stone and floating lights where dozens of alien species sat at a long curved table that seemed to go on forever, and every seat was filled with something powerful and dangerous and hungry. Ethan found his place near the middle of the table, a small chair clearly designed for a smaller species, and he sat down and tried to look like he belonged there. To his left was a Rithani trade delegate, a tall insectoid creature with compound eyes that reflected the light like shattered mirrors, and to his right was something he could not identify, a mass of wet tendrils that smelled like copper and salt and did not seem interested in conversation. At the head of the table sat Archon Vreth himself, a Glaciari of impressive size, nearly 3 meters tall with a body like an armored predator wrapped in ceremonial robes of deep purple, his 4 eyes scanning the room with the lazy confidence of something that had never once in its life been afraid. The food began to arrive. Course after course was brought out by servants who moved in silence, their eyes cast down, their hands trembling slightly, and each dish was more elaborate than the last, towers of alien flesh and crystallized organs and things that moved on the plate in ways that made Ethan's stomach tight. He ate what he could, picking carefully at dishes that Mara identified as safe for human consumption, and he smiled and nodded and said the right things when the right species looked his way, and he played the part of the grateful guest as well as any man could. The Glaciari around him ate with enthusiasm, tearing into their food with teeth and claws, and the sounds of the feast were wet and loud, and primal in a way that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. "You are enjoying yourself, human," Archon Vreth called from the head of the table, his voice deep and rumbling like thunder trapped in a chest. "The hospitality is extraordinary," Ethan said, and he meant none of it. "Good," Vreth said, and his 4 eyes narrowed with something that might have been pleasure. "Because the final course is my personal favorite, a delicacy that I reserve for only the most honored guests." The room grew quiet. Every alien at the table stopped eating and turned their attention to the center of the hall, where a set of doors opened slowly, and a team of servants emerged carrying a single golden plate on a platform of carved black stone. They set it before Ethan. He looked down. On the plate was a creature. It was small, no bigger than a human child's hand, and its body glowed with soft bioluminescent light that shifted between blue and violet and pale green like a tiny living aurora. And it had wide dark eyes that took up most of its face and thin, delicate limbs that trembled against the cold surface of the golden plate. It was alive. It was looking at him. And then Ethan felt something he had never felt before, a pressure behind his eyes, not painful but deep, like someone pressing a warm hand against the inside of his skull. And suddenly there were images flooding his mind that were not his own. Fear, raw and absolute and bottomless, the fear of a small creature that knew exactly what was about to happen to it. And beneath the fear there was something else, a word that was not a word, a feeling shaped like language, and it said, "Please." Ethan's hand stopped moving, his fork suspended in the air between the plate and his mouth, and the entire table went silent, every alien eye turning toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement to contempt. "It is a Velith," Archon Vreth said casually, leaning back in his enormous chair. "They are bred specifically for this purpose. Their empathic abilities add a certain flavor to the experience that no other species can replicate. The terror makes the meat sweeter, or so I am told." Ethan stared at the creature on his plate. It stared back at him. Its tiny body was shaking so hard that the bioluminescent light flickering across its skin looked like a candle in a storm, and its dark eyes held something that Ethan recognized because he had seen it before in the eyes of prisoners and refugees and children caught in wars they did not start. It was the look of something that knew it was going to die and had chosen to spend its last moments hopping anyway. Ethan set down his fork. The sound of metal touching the golden plate rang through the silent hall like a bell. "You do not eat?" Vreth asked, and there was an edge to his voice now, the amusement draining away and something colder taking its place. "No," Ethan said. A murmur rippled through the table, alien voices whispering in languages Ethan did not speak. But the tone was universal, surprise, mockery, and a thin thread of something that might have been unease. "It is a great insult to refuse the final course," Vreth said slowly, his 4 eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that could have melted steel. "It suggests that you believe yourself above our customs, that you judge us." "I am not judging anyone," Ethan said, and his voice was steady even though his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. "I am asking a question." "Then ask." Ethan looked at the tiny creature on his plate one more time, and he felt that telepathic pulse again, fainter now, weaker, like a light running out of power, and he looked up at the most powerful predator in the sector and said, "Where did you get them?" The silence that followed Ethan's question lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a year, and then Archon Vreth did something that surprised everyone at the table. He laughed. It was a deep and terrible sound, like rocks grinding together in the belly of a mountain, and the other Glaciari at the table joined in, their laughter filling the banquet hall like a wave of noise that pressed against Ethan's chest. "The human has a curiosity," Vreth said, wiping a clawed hand across his mouth. "How charming, how wonderfully primitive you see a small glowing thing, and your instinct is not hunger but sympathy. This is why your species will never sit at the head of any table." The other alien guests shifted in their seats, some amused, some uncomfortable. And the Rathani trade delegate beside Ethan leaned slightly away from him, as if his refusal to eat was a disease that could spread through proximity. Ethan did not laugh, and he did not look away, and he did not apologize. He simply sat there with his hands flat on the table, and the tiny velith still trembling on the golden plate before him, its bioluminescent glow fading to a dim and exhausted pulse like a heartbeat running out of time. The banquet ended shortly after that. Ethan was escorted back to his guest quarters by two glaciary guards who said nothing, and looked at him the way a cat looks at something too small to be worth killing. And when the door sealed behind him, he stood alone in the dark room and pressed his back against the wall and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for hours. "Mara," he said. "I am here, Captain. What do we know about the velith?" There was a brief pause, the kind Mara used when she was sorting through vast amounts of data and deciding how much of it would make him angry. "The velith are a species native to a small temperate world in the Oreth Nebula region," Mara said. "They were first catalogued approximately 160 galactic standard years ago by a glaciary survey fleet. Initial reports described them as a pre-industrial civilization with complex social structures, rudimentary agriculture, and a unique form of telepathic communication based on empathic resonance." "They had a civilization," Ethan said. "They had cities," Mara corrected. "Small ones, but yes, they had organized communities with leadership structures and oral traditions, and what xenoanthropologists would classify as early-stage culture. And now they are food." Approximately 30 years after first contact, the glaciari filed a petition with the Galactic Concord to reclassify the velith from sapient species to non-sapient fauna. Mara continued. The petition was supported by a series of neurological studies funded by glaciari institutions, which argued that the velith's telepathic communication was a reflexive biological response, rather than true language, and that their social behaviors were instinctive rather than cultural. And the Concord believed that. The Concord accepted it, Mara said, and there was something in her synthetic voice that sounded almost like disgust. "There is a difference. 17 species filed objections, but none of them had enough political or economic leverage to challenge the glaciari. The reclassification was approved, and the velith were legally designated as livestock." Ethan closed his eyes and pressed his fists against the cold metal wall, and breathed slowly through his nose. "I want to see them," he said. "Captain, that would be inadvisable. The trade negotiations." "I want to see them, Mara." She paused again. "I can request a cultural tour of the station's lower decks under your diplomatic credentials," she said. "The glaciari maintain an open-access policy for allied species in most non-restricted areas. However, I should note that the farming decks are technically classified as agricultural facilities and may require additional clearance." "Get me in." It took Mara 40 minutes to arrange the access, and during those 40 minutes Ethan sat in his quarters and stared at the wall and thought about the look in that small creature's eyes, and the way its telepathic plea had felt inside his mind. Not like words, but like a hand reaching out in the dark. The farming decks were located deep in the belly of the station, past the luxury levels and the trade floors and the entertainment districts, down in the parts of the throne of indulgence that the honored guests were never meant to see. The elevator took him down for what felt like a very long time. When the doors opened, the smell hit him first. A thick, wet animal smell layered with chemicals and something metallic that he recognized from old battlefields as the scent of blood that had been cleaned but never truly washed away. The corridor was lit with harsh white light, and the walls were bare metal, and the floors were grated so that whatever fell through them could be hosed away. And as Ethan walked deeper into the facility, he began to hear sounds. Small sounds. Sounds that a person might mistake for birds or insects if they were not paying attention. But Ethan was paying attention, and he knew what those sounds were because he had heard them before in refugee camps and bombed-out shelters, and every terrible place where living things were kept in conditions no living thing should endure. They were voices. The pens stretched out in rows that seemed to go on forever, hundreds of them, each one containing between 5 and 20 velith, their small bioluminescent bodies huddled together in clusters that pulsed with dim light, and their dark eyes tracked Ethan as he walked past with an intelligence that no honest scientist could ever have called instinctive. He stopped at one of the larger pens near the back of the facility. Inside was a velith that was clearly older than the others, her light dimmer and steadier, her body marked with faint scars that told stories Ethan did not need telepathy to read, and she sat apart from the younger ones with the quiet dignity of someone who had been carrying an impossible weight for a very long time. She looked at Ethan, and then she reached out with her mind. It was different from the desperate scream of the creature on the plate. This was controlled and deliberate and gentle, like a hand extended in greeting rather than in panic, and the images she sent were not of fear but of memory. He saw a world, green and warm and full of light, where small bioluminescent creatures moved through forests of crystal-tipped trees and gathered by rivers that glowed with reflected starlight, and they sang to each other not with sound but with light and feeling, their emotions rippling through the air like music made visible. He saw children learning to shape their first telepathic words, clumsy bursts of color and sensation that made the adults around them hum with warmth. He saw communities building shelters from woven plant fibers and carved stone, simple structures but beautiful in their simplicity, made with care and intention, and something that could only be called love. And then he saw the ships come. Dark shapes descending from a sky that had never held anything but stars, and the fear that followed was so vast and so complete that it nearly knocked Ethan off his feet. The elder velith pulled back her mind gently and looked at him with those enormous dark eyes and sent one final thought. Remember us, that is enough. Ethan stood there in the harsh white light of that terrible place, with tears running down his face and his hands shaking at his sides, and he whispered, "No, it is not." He walked back to his quarters and opened a secure channel to Earth's diplomatic corps, and told them everything he had seen and everything he had felt, and asked for authorization to file a formal challenge to the velith's classification. The response came back in 12 minutes. "Stand down, Captain Cole. The Cassara Belt negotiations take priority. Sign the trade agreement and return to Earth. This is not our fight." Ethan stared at the screen for a long time. Then he closed the channel. "Mara," he said. "Yes, Captain. Pull up everything we have on galactic sentience law, every loophole, every precedent, every forgotten clause in every treaty that the conquered has ever ratified. Captain, I must advise you that acting against direct orders from the diplomatic corps could result in criminal charges, loss of your commission, and permanent blacklisting from Mara." "Yes, Captain." "Pull it up." "Already searching," she said, and if an artificial intelligence could smile, Ethan thought he heard it in her voice. "We are not leaving." Mara worked through the night while Ethan sat on the floor of his quarters with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, not sleeping but thinking, turning the problem over in his mind like a stone he could not stop touching. The Glaciari had power and money and centuries of legal precedent on their side, and Ethan had a courier ship and a disobedient AI, and a set of diplomatic credentials that would probably be revoked within the next 48 hours, once Earth figured out he was not planning to follow orders. It was not exactly a fair fight. But Ethan had learned a long time ago that fair fights were for people who had the luxury of choosing their battles, and he had stopped being that kind of person the first time he saw what happens when good men decide that someone else's suffering is not their problem. "I found something," Mara said at 3 in the morning station time, and there was a note of excitement in her synthetic voice that Ethan had never heard before. "Talk to me." The Galactic Concord of Species, ratified 612 years ago. is the foundational legal framework governing interspecies relations in this sector. MARA began. Most of its articles deal with trade, territorial disputes, and military conduct, but Article 7 deals specifically with the classification and protection of sapient species. I know Article 7, Ethan said. It is the law the Glaciari used to reclassify the Velith. Correct, but Article 7 has 41 subsections, and most of them have never been invoked because the situations they describe have never occurred, until now. Ethan opened his eyes. Subsection 33, MARA said, and she projected the text onto the wall of his quarters in glowing blue letters. It states that any species which demonstrates reciprocal empathic communication with a registered sapient species is automatically granted provisional sapient status, pending a formal review by the conquered tribunal. Ethan read the words 3 times. Reciprocal empathic communication, he said slowly. The Velith communicated with you telepathically, MARA said, not as a reflex, not as an instinctive biological response, but as a deliberate act of communication. The creature on the plate sent you a specific and intentional plea, and the elder in the pens shared complex memories and abstract concepts with you in a structured and controlled manner. Both of these interactions were reciprocal because you understood them and responded. And I am a registered sapient species. You are a human being, and humanity has been a registered sapient species in the Galactic Concord for 187 years, which means your interaction with the Velith meets every criterion outlined in subsection 33. Ethan stood up. What happens when I file? If you file a formal subsection 33 claim with documented evidence of reciprocal empathic communication, the Concord Tribunal is legally required to open a provisional review, MARA said. And during the review period, which lasts a minimum of 30 galactic standard days, all harvesting, trade, transport, and consumption of the species in question must cease immediately across all conquered member territories. All of it. The law is absolute on this point. It was written to prevent exactly the kind of situation the Velith are in, a species being exploited while its status is under dispute. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been wound tight since the moment he looked down at that golden plate and saw those dark eyes looking back at him. File it, he said. Captain, I need to inform you of the risks. File it, MARA. Filing requires your diplomatic courier credentials as authentication. Once the claim is submitted, those credentials are locked to the case and cannot be revoked by Earth's diplomatic corps without a tribunal order, which means Earth cannot pull you out of this even if they want to. But it also means you are personally and legally responsible for the claim and any consequences that follow. I understand. The Glaciari will respond aggressively. Their entire luxury food industry is built on Velith farming. The economic impact of a 30-day moratorium alone would be measured in billions of galactic credits. They will come after you personally. I understand. You could lose everything, your commission, your ship, your freedom, and possibly your life. The Glaciari have a long history of making problems disappear quietly. Ethan looked at the wall where the text of subsection 33 still glowed in blue light, and he thought about Tisha sitting in that pen with her scars and her steady light, and the way she had shown him her world, as if she were handing him something precious that she had been keeping safe for years. File it, he said for the 3rd time. MARA filed the claim at 3:27 in the morning station time, transmitting it directly to the Galactic Concord Tribunal through a secure diplomatic channel that bypassed every Glaciari communication filter on the station. And the moment it was received, a confirmation ping echoed back through the system like a starting gun. It took the Glaciari exactly 94 minutes to find out what he had done. The door to Ethan's quarters did not open so much as it was torn aside, the metal frame buckling inward as Archon Vreth Salon himself stepped through the gap. his enormous body filling the doorway, his 4 eyes burning with a fury so intense that the air around him seemed to vibrate. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Vreth said, and his voice was no longer the smooth rumble of a confident predator. It was the growl of something wounded and dangerous. "I filed a legal claim with the Galactic Concord Tribunal," Ethan said, and he was amazed at how calm his voice sounded, because his legs were shaking so hard he was not sure they would hold him. "Under Article 7, subsection 33 of the Concord of Species, the Velith have demonstrated reciprocal empathic communication with a registered sapient species, which triggers an automatic provisional review of their classification." "You dare?" Vreth hissed, stepping closer, his claws leaving deep scratches in the metal floor. "You dare use our own laws against us? You are nothing. Your species is nothing. You have been part of this galaxy for the blink of an eye, and you presume to lecture the Glaciari about what is and is not sapient." "I am not lecturing anyone," Ethan said. "I am invoking a law that your species helped to ratify 600 years ago. If the Velith are truly non-sapient, then the review will confirm that and nothing will change. You have nothing to fear from the truth." Vreth's 4 eyes narrowed to slits, and he leaned down until his face was close enough to Ethan's that the human could smell the meat on his breath, and see the remains of the evening's feast caught between teeth, the size of his fingers. "You think this is about truth," Vreth whispered. "This is about power, little human, and you have none. I will give you one chance. Withdraw your filing, sign the trade agreement, and leave this station, and I will pretend this never happened." Ethan looked up at the creature towering over him and felt the weight of every threat pressing down on his shoulders like gravity itself had doubled. And he thought about what Mara had said about losing everything: his career, his ship, his freedom, his life. And then he thought about Tisha. "Let me tell you something about my species," Ethan said quietly. "We are young out here. You are right about that, but we are not new to this. Long before we ever reached the stars, we did something terrible. We enslaved our own kind. We bought and sold human beings like livestock, and we told ourselves it was natural and right, and that the people we were hurting were less than us because it made it easier to sleep at night." Vreth said nothing. "And then we fought wars over it," Ethan continued. "Brutal and bloody wars that tore our civilization apart. And we did it not because it was easy or because we had nothing to lose, but because enough of us looked at what we were doing and decided that no amount of profit or tradition or power was worth the price of pretending that a living, thinking, feeling creature was a thing to be owned and consumed." He met the Archon's 4-eyed gaze without blinking. "The measure of a species is not what it can dominate," Ethan said. "It is what it refuses to." Vreth stared at him for a long time, and then he straightened to his full height, and the fury in his eyes hardened into something cold and calculating, and far more dangerous than rage. "Then you will learn what it means to refuse the Glaciari," Vreth said, and he turned and walked out of the room, and the torn metal of the doorframe groaned behind him like a warning. Within the hour, Ethan's quarters were sealed from the outside. His communication access was cut to everything except the tribunal's secure channel, and the station's internal sensors showed a massive increase in activity on the farming decks below. Mara broke through the communication block, using a frequency the Glaciari had not thought to jam, and her voice came through Ethan's earpiece tight with urgency. "Captain, they are accelerating processing on the farming decks. Thermal and biological sensors indicate that they are moving Velith from the breeding pens to the processing lines at 10 times the normal rate." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "They are trying to destroy the evidence before the tribunal can act." "Yes," Mara said. "At the current rate, every Velith on the station will be dead within 6 hours. Ethan stood in his sealed quarters with the clock running down, and the lives of thousands of innocent beings ticking away beneath his feet, and he made a decision that he knew would change everything. "Mara, can you get me out of this room?" I can override the door locks in approximately 4 minutes. Do it. Captain, what is the plan? Ethan picked up his sidearm from the table and checked the charge and took a deep breath. We are going to make them stop. The door to Ethan's quarters hissed open 4 minutes and 11 seconds after Mara began working on the lock, and the corridor beyond was empty because the Glaciari had not expected a single human locked in a room to be worth guarding. That was their first mistake. Ethan moved quickly through the upper levels of the station, keeping to maintenance corridors that Mara guided him through using a map she had quietly assembled during their earlier tour of the lower decks, and his boots made almost no sound on the metal grating as he descended deeper into the throne of indulgence. Captain, Mara said in his ear, before you reach the farming decks I need to tell you something. Talk fast. Even if you physically reach the processing lines, you cannot stop them alone. There are over 200 Glaciari workers and security personnel on those decks. You have a sidearm with enough charge for approximately 40 shots, and you are one human being. I know the math, Mara. Then you know that fighting is not the answer. Ethan stopped at a junction where 2 corridors met and pressed his back against the wall and breathed. What is the answer? The Glaciari are accelerating the slaughter because they want to destroy the evidence before the tribunal can see it, Mara said. But what if the evidence was not just on this station? What if it was everywhere? Ethan understood. You want to broadcast it. The station's main communication array is powerful enough to reach every major galactic news network, every diplomatic channel, and every tribunal relay within a radius of 800 light-years. Mara said, if I can access the array, I can transmit a live feed from the farming decks to every screen and receiver in the sector simultaneously. Can you access it? The array's control systems are isolated from the main network, but they run on Glaciari military encryption, which is robust but not impenetrable. I would need approximately 12 minutes of uninterrupted access to a physical terminal connected to the array's subsystems. Where is the nearest terminal? Communications Hub, Deck 14. It is 2 levels above the farming decks, and it is currently staffed by 3 Glaciari technicians. Ethan checked his sidearm again and started moving. And Captain, Mara added, once I begin the broadcast, the Glaciari will know exactly where the signal is coming from. You will have minutes at most before they send security. Then we better make those minutes count. The communications hub on Deck 14 was a circular room filled with glowing consoles and holographic displays that showed data streams from across the station. And the 3 Glaciari technicians inside were focused on their work, with the bored efficiency of people who had never expected anyone to walk through their door uninvited. Ethan walked through their door uninvited. The first technician turned and saw a human pointing a weapon at him and froze with an expression of such complete confusion that under different circumstances, it might have been funny. I need everyone to step away from the consoles, Ethan said in a voice that carried the calm authority of a man who had given orders in situations far worse than this one. I am not here to hurt anyone, but I will defend myself if I have to. The 3 technicians looked at each other and then at the small human with the small weapon, and they made the sensible decision to move away from their stations, because Glaciari technicians were not soldiers, and they had no interest in dying for their employer's communication equipment. Mara went to work. Through the station's internal sensor network, she had already tapped into the surveillance feeds from the farming decks, and what those feeds showed was something that no amount of political maneuvering or legal argument could ever describe as clearly as the raw, unfiltered images themselves. The processing lines were running at full capacity. Velith were being moved in groups from their pens through narrow corridors lit with that same harsh white light, their small bioluminescent bodies pressed together so tightly that their individual lights merged into a single trembling glow. and their telepathic distress was so intense that even the non-telepathic species working the lines had begun to show signs of discomfort, rubbing their heads and wincing as they herded the creatures forward. At the end of the corridors were the machines. Ethan did not look at the machines for long because he did not need to and because some images once seen cannot be unseen, and he had already collected enough of those to last several lifetimes. "Beginning broadcast," Mara said, and her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it that Ethan had never heard from her before, something that sounded like anger. The signal went out like a shockwave. It hit the Rithani Collective's diplomatic network first, then the independent news feeds that operated in the border regions, then the major galactic broadcast networks one by one like dominoes falling, and within seconds the images from the farming decks of the Throne of Indulgence were playing on screens across 1,000 worlds. Billions of beings saw it. They saw the pens and the corridors and the trembling lights and the machines, and they saw the faces of the Velith, those enormous dark eyes filled with an intelligence and a terror that no amount of scientific reclassification could hide. "Captain," Mara said, "security teams are converging on your position. You have approximately 3 minutes before they reach this deck." Ethan sealed the door to the communications hub and barricaded it with every piece of furniture in the room, and then he turned and ran for the farming decks, because the broadcast was only half of what needed to happen. The other half was making sure there were still living Velith when the tribunal finally acted. He reached the farming decks through a service elevator that the security teams had not thought to lock down yet, because they were focused on the communications hub, and that was their second mistake. The main corridor leading to the processing lines was a long straight passage with metal walls and grated floors, and at the far end Ethan could see the Glajari workers moving in organized lines, pushing groups of Velith toward the machines with mechanical efficiency. Ethan stepped into the corridor and raised his weapon, and fired a single shot into the ceiling. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, and every creature in the corridor stopped moving, Glajari and Velith alike, and dozens of eyes turned to look at the lone human standing at the other end of the passage. "Processing stops now," Ethan said, and his voice echoed off the metal walls like a command given in a cathedral. A Glajari supervisor stepped forward, a heavy-set creature with scars on his arms and the irritated expression of someone whose workday had just been interrupted by something he considered very small and very stupid. "You have no authority here, human," the supervisor said. "The Galactic Concord Tribunal has received a subsection 33 filing on behalf of the Velith species," Ethan said. "A provisional review has been opened, which means all harvesting and processing must cease immediately. That is not my authority, that is the law. We have received no such order." "You will," Ethan said. "And when you do, the tribunal will also have access to a live broadcast that is currently being watched by approximately 2 billion beings across the sector, showing exactly what is happening on these decks right now." The supervisor's expression changed. Behind Ethan, the sound of heavy boots told him the security teams had found him, and he could hear the whine of weapons charging and the growl of Glajari voices giving orders. And he knew that in a straight fight he would last approximately 4 seconds. He did not move. He stood in that corridor with enemies in front of him and enemies behind him, and his weapon pointed at the ceiling, and his feet planted on the grated floor as if they had grown roots, and he waited. The security teams did not fire. They did not fire because MARA had made sure that every weapon discharge on the farming decks would be broadcast live to the same 2 billion viewers who were already watching. And the Glajari were many things, but they were not stupid enough to execute a human diplomat on camera in front of the entire galaxy. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. And then a sound came through the station's internal speakers that made every Glajari on the farming deck stop moving. a deep, resonant tone that Ethan did not recognize. But that clearly meant something significant because the security teams lowered their weapons, and the supervisor's face went pale beneath his scales. It was the tribunal's emergency injunction, a legally binding cease and desist order transmitted directly to the station's command systems, authenticated with the highest level of conquered authority, ordering the immediate cessation of all Velith processing operations, pending the completion of a formal sapience review. The machine stopped. The corridor went quiet. Ethan lowered his weapon, and his legs finally gave out, and he sat down hard against the wall and realized that his hands were shaking and that there was blood on his shirt from a wound he did not remember receiving, and that the world was going slightly gray at the edges. He had taken hits during the fight through the upper decks, impacts from stun rounds and shrapnel from the barricade that the security teams had breached, and his body was only now informing him of the cost because the adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain was arriving like a delayed train. He sat there bleeding on the metal floor of a slaughterhouse that had just been forced to close its doors, and he watched as the Velith in the corridor began to slowly stop trembling. A small figure moved through the crowd of confused Glaciari workers and frightened Velith, and made its way to where Ethan sat slumped against the wall. Tisha. The elder Velith climbed up onto the grating beside him and placed one tiny hand against his face, and her skin was warm and her bioluminescent light pulsed with a soft, steady rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat at rest. She sent him an image. Not a memory this time, but something she was creating in that moment. A picture assembled from feeling and light and the deepest part of her mind. It was a sunrise, golden and warm and impossibly beautiful, breaking over a horizon that Ethan had never seen with his own eyes, but that he recognized immediately from the memories she had shared with him in the pens. It was her world. The world the Glaciari had taken from her people. The world she had carried inside herself for decades like a flame she refused to let die. And she was showing it to him, now not as a memory of loss, but as a promise of return. Ethan closed his eyes and let the image fill him, and for a moment the pain and the blood and the harsh white lights disappeared, and there was nothing but that sunrise and the warmth of a small hand against his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Tisha sent back a feeling that needed no translation. But the fight was not over yet. The injunction was temporary, 30 Galactic Standard days, and when those days were up, the conquered tribunal would hold a formal hearing to determine the Velith's fate once and for all. And the Glaciari were already calling in every favor and every lawyer and every political weapon they had to make sure that hearing ended the way they wanted. Ethan had bought the Velith a month. Now he had to win them a future. The conquered spire rose from the surface of a neutral moon like a needle made of glass and light, piercing the sky so high that its upper chambers sat above the atmosphere itself and looked out into naked space. And it was here that the fate of every disputed species in the galaxy had been decided for 6 centuries. Ethan arrived 23 days after the injunction was issued, his wound still healing beneath his uniform, a fatting bruise on his jaw the color of a storm cloud, and he walked through the enormous entrance hall of the spire feeling very small and very human and very much alone. The Glaciari delegation had arrived 3 days before him. They had come with a fleet of legal advocates from 7 different species, each one selected for their expertise in interspecies classification law, and they had brought geneticists and neurobiologists and behavioral scientists carrying centuries of research that supported the position that the Velith were exactly what the Glaciari had always claimed they were: beautiful and empathic and valuable but fundamentally non-sapient creatures operating on instinct rather than intelligence. Archon Vreth Salon sat at the center of his delegation like a king holding court, and when Ethan entered the tribunal chamber, their eyes met across the vast room, and Vreth smiled the smile of a predator who had recovered from his surprise, and was now ready to finish what the smaller creature had foolishly started. Ethan took his seat at the petitioner's table, and it was just him and MARA's portable terminal, and a stack of files that looked painfully thin compared to the mountain of documentation the Glaciari had brought. The tribunal consisted of 9 judges drawn from 9 different species, none of them Glaciari and none of them human, chosen specifically for their neutrality, and they sat in elevated chairs arranged in a semicircle above the chamber floor looking down at both parties with expressions that gave away nothing. The head judge was a Keithrani, an ancient species of crystalline beings who communicated through harmonic vibrations, and when she spoke her voice rang through the chamber like a bell struck once in a silent room. This tribunal convenes to review the sapience classification of the species known as Velith, native to the Orath Nebula region, currently classified as non-sapient fauna under Galactic Concord Registry. The petitioner has invoked Article 7 subsection 33 citing evidence of reciprocal empathic communication. The respondent contests this claim. We will hear both sides. The Glaciari went first. Their lead advocate was a Minari, a species known throughout the galaxy for their analytical minds, and their ability to construct arguments so precise and so layered that opposing them felt like trying to argue with mathematics itself. And he spoke for 2 hours presenting study after study showing that the Velith's telepathic emissions were neurological reflexes comparable to the pheromone signals of non-sapient insects. He presented brain scans and behavioral models and statistical analyses, and he spoke with such confidence and such authority that, by the time he finished, even Ethan found himself wondering for a terrible moment if maybe the Glaciari were right. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stood up and opened his mouth, and before he could speak the doors at the back of the chamber opened, and a group of people walked in that made him stop and stare. Humans. Dozens of them. They wore the uniforms and credentials of Earth's academic and diplomatic institutions. Linguists from the University of New Geneva, neurologists from the Kolkata Institute of Xenoscience, child psychologists from the Sao Paulo Center for Developmental Studies, ethicists from the Edinburgh School of Interspecies Philosophy, and at the front of the group was a woman in the formal black suit of the United Earth Parliament's legal division carrying a case file that was 3 times the size of Ethan's. Her name was Director Amara Osai, and she walked up to Ethan's table and set down the case file and looked at him with eyes that were tired from the journey but burning with something fierce and unbreakable. "Earth sent you," Ethan said, and he could not keep the surprise out of his voice. "Earth tried very hard not to send us," Amara said, "but the broadcast changed things. 200 million humans watched what was happening on that station, and they made it very clear to Parliament that standing by was not an option. The vote was unanimous." Ethan looked at the team of scientists and scholars filing into the seats behind him, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he had been holding tight for weeks. "We brought evidence," Amara said, and the word evidence did not do justice to what the team had assembled. The linguists went first. They had obtained recordings of Velith telepathic communications from the station's surveillance feeds, the same feeds MARA had used for the broadcast, and they had spent 3 weeks analyzing the patterns and structures of those communications using the most advanced xenolinguistic models available to human science. What they found was language. Not reflexive signals, not instinctive pheromone pulses, but structured recursive language with grammar and syntax and vocabulary. A language built on emotion and image rather than sound, but no less complex for it, with tenses and conditionals and abstract concepts, and even what appeared to be humor. The neurologists followed with brain scan comparisons, showing that Velith neural activity during communication was functionally identical to the patterns observed in every known sapient species language centers. Not the simple stimulus response loops of instinctive behavior, but the deep complex processing of beings who were choosing their words. The ethicists presented evidence of Velith cultural practices observed in the farming pens, mourning rituals performed when members of a group were taken to the processing lines, teaching behaviors where older Velith guided younger ones in controlling their telepathic abilities, and a system of social hierarchy based not on strength or dominance, but on wisdom and emotional depth. And then the child psychologist took the stand. Her name was Dr. Lena Vasquez, and she had spent her career studying emotional development in human children, and she had been given access to the Velith, who had been rescued from the station after the injunction. She testified that the emotional development of a juvenile Velith was comparable in complexity and depth to that of a human child of approximately 7 years of age, that they formed attachments, experienced grief, displayed empathy for other species, and demonstrated the capacity for abstract thought, including the ability to imagine futures that did not yet exist. The chamber was very quiet when she finished. The Glajari delegation responded aggressively, their advocates attacking every study, questioning every methodology, demanding additional reviews and extended timelines, and Archon Vreth himself rose from his seat and played his final card. "If this tribunal rules against the Glajari hegemony," Vreth said, his voice filling the enormous chamber like the sound of a door closing, "we will withdraw from the Galactic Concord, our fleets, our trade networks, our economic partnerships, all of it gone, and every species in this room that depends on Glajari commerce will feel the cost of this human sentimentality." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Some of the judges shifted in their seats, and Ethan could see the calculation happening behind their neutral expressions. The Glajari were too big and too powerful and too deeply embedded in the galactic economy to lose, and everyone in the room knew it. The head judge looked at Ethan. "Does the petitioner wish to make a final statement?" Ethan stood up and looked at the 9 judges and at the Glajari delegation, and at the human team behind him, and at the vast chamber that held the power to decide whether an entire species would live as people or die as food. He did not give a grand speech. "I would like to call one witness," he said. The doors at the side of the chamber opened, and Tisha walked in. She was so small in that enormous room that she was almost invisible, a tiny figure glowing with soft bioluminescent light that pulsed in steady rhythms of blue and violet. And she walked across the stone floor with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had waited a very long time for this moment, and intended to be present for every second of it. She stopped in the center of the chamber and looked up at the 9 judges and at the hundreds of beings watching from the gallery, and she did not tremble and she did not look afraid. Ethan knelt beside her and placed his hand on the floor, palm up, and Tisha placed her small hand on his and closed her enormous dark eyes. And then she opened her mind. Not just to Ethan this time, but to everyone. The telepathic wave that moved through the chamber was unlike anything any of them had ever felt. It was not a scream and it was not a plea. It was an invitation, and every being in the room found themselves standing in a world they had never seen. They saw green forests and crystal-tipped trees and rivers that glowed under stars that had names in a language made of light. They saw children playing and elders teaching and communities building and songs being sung without sound in colors that had no names in any spoken tongue. They saw a people. They saw them as they had been before the ships came, and they saw them as they were now, broken and caged and farmed, but still holding onto something that no amount of cruelty had been able to destroy. A sense of who they were, a memory of home, a belief that someone somewhere would eventually look at them and see not a meal but a mind. The vision lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the chamber was completely silent. Several of the judges had tears on their faces, and even the Minari advocate for the Glajari was standing very still with his eyes wide and his mouth slightly open. The head judge's crystalline body was vibrating with a harmonic frequency that Ethan's translator could not process, but that everyone in the room understood instinctively. It was grief. The tribunal deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned to the chamber, the head judge spoke in a voice that rang with absolute clarity and absolute certainty. The tribunal rules unanimously. The Velith are granted full sapient status under the Galactic Concord of Species. All glaciary farming operations involving Velith are to be dismantled immediately. A full repatriation program will be established to return all surviving Velith to their homeworld. Any species or individual found to be in violation of this ruling will face the full penalties prescribed by Concord law. She paused and looked directly at Archon Vreth. The glaciary hegemony's threat to withdraw from the Concord has been noted. Should the hegemony choose this course, it will do so alone. No other member species has expressed support for this position. Vreth sat in his chair and said nothing because there was nothing to say. His bluff had been called and the galaxy had chosen. And for the first time in his long and powerful life, the Archon of the glaciary understood what it felt like to be the smaller creature in the room. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood on the observation deck of a Rithani transport ship and watched through the viewport as the first shuttles descended through the atmosphere of a small green world in the Oreth Nebula. The Velith homeworld. It was exactly as Tisha had shown him, the crystal-tipped trees catching the light of a gentle sun, the rivers winding through valleys that glowed with reflected starlight even in daylight, a world that had been waiting quietly for its people to come home. Tisha stood beside him on the observation deck, her small body glowing with a light brighter and steadier than he had ever seen from her, and she watched her world grow larger in the viewport with eyes that held something beyond happiness, something deeper than relief, something that her people had a word for in their language of light and feeling, but that humans could only approximate. Home. She placed her hand on Ethan's arm and sent him one final image, not a memory and not a vision but a concept, an abstract idea shaped in light and warmth and wrapped in gratitude so deep it felt like standing in an ocean. The closest translation was this, the one who stood when no one else would. Ethan watched the shuttles descend, carrying the first free Velith to touch their own soil in over a century, and he did not try to stop the tears that ran down his face, because some things were worth crying over, and this was one of them. Behind him, Mara chimed softly in his earpiece. Captain, Earth's diplomatic corps is on the line. They want to discuss your next assignment. Apparently, there are several other species classification cases that have been reopened in the wake of the Velith ruling, and they would like someone with experience in this area too. Tell them I am busy, Ethan said. You are watching a window. Exactly. He stood there for a long time watching the sunrise break golden and warm over a world the galaxy had forgotten, a world that a small brave people had kept alive in their hearts through decades of darkness, a world that existed again because one man had looked down at his plate and decided that some things matter more than trade deals and mineral rights and the approval of creatures who measure their worth by what they can consume. The sunrise climbed higher, and the light filled the viewport, and somewhere down on the surface below, a Velith child, who had never seen an open sky, looked up for the first time, and sang a song made of color and warmth and wonder. And across the stars, the galaxy watched and remembered what a single human being had taught them. That the smallest voice in the room can shake the foundations of the largest empire. That conscience is not weakness, but the most dangerous weapon a species can carry. And that sometimes the measure of a civilization is not found in its power or its technology or its conquest, but in the moment when one person looks at something helpless on a plate and says, "No."